Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for our ongoing Gubernatorial Candidates Forum series. I'm Ron Halber, and I'm the Executive Director of the JCRC of Greater Washington, and we're very pleased this morning to have Maryland gubernatorial candidate John King with us. Before we begin, you should know that the program is being recorded. Also, if you want to access closed captioning, please click on the live transcript button on your screen. And please, folks, out of respect, please turn on your video. And finally, after we hear from our candidate, I will moderate a Q&A session. Please do not unmute yourself unless I ask you to, and then please ask your question in a succinct fashion. Or if you prefer, just put it in the chat box and we will ask it. As a 501c3, the JCRC does not support or endorse any candidate for public office. However, these meetings are very crucial and critical to fulfilling our mission to educate the Jewish community and promote civic participation. The JCRC serves as the public affairs and community relations arm of the Greater Washington area's Jewish community. And we represent more than 100 organizations, synagogues, and schools, and advocate for the needs and values of the Jewish community, but also for the well-being of everyone in our region, especially the most vulnerable. The JCRC engages in government relations, interfaith efforts, Israel advocacy, fighting anti-Semitism, promoting security, working in our schools, and pursuing social justice. We are strongly committed to cultivating a society that is based on freedom, equity, justice, and pluralism. Now let me introduce our guest. John King has spent his career as a lifetime educator, from teacher to principal to administrator, and to eventually to the top of our educational system as President Obama's Secretary of Education. Today, John leads an education civil rights organization and is a professor of the University of Maryland at College Park. John had a tough childhood. He lost both his parents at a young age. He says school and the teachers he met made all the difference in the world to him. These teachers instilled a sense of hope and possibility and gave him a second chance during a very difficult time, and only emphasizes what we all know, the importance of having mentors in a child's life. I myself was the benefit of many mentors who helped me in my professional and personal growth. John lives in Silver Spring with his wife, Melissa, and two daughters who attend public schools. Now listen to this fact. Their home is 25 miles from where his great-grandfather, Charles King, and his family were enslaved. In fact, the cabin where his ancestors lived still stands today in Gaithersburg. And just one generation later, in 1894, his grandmother was among the earliest graduates of the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. Clearly, education, John, is in your DNA, and your family history is incredible. And we're so pleased that you are able to join us today. So I guess we could start off by saying, John, why are you running for governor?
Well, thanks so much for the warm introduction and the opportunity to join you this morning. You know, I'll tell you, I'm running for governor for the very same reasons that I went into public service in the first place. A deep belief in the role that public institutions can play in people's lives. And as you just described, for me, that began with public school. Both my parents were educators. My mom was a teacher and school counselor. My dad was a teacher and administrator. But they both passed away when I was little. My mom when I was 8 and my dad when I was 12.
John, how did they pass away from what reason, if you don't mind sharing?
So sure. So my mom had a heart attack very suddenly when I was in 4th grade, October 4th grade. And then I lived with my dad. My dad was struggling with Alzheimer's, although no one knew. I didn't know why he was acting the way he was. I didn't know why.
So it must have been early onset, right? Quite early.
Well, he was much older. He was 66
okay.
when I was born. Yeah.
Right.
So, but you know, in that time, in the early 80s, Alzheimer's was not talked about as much. I certainly didn't know about it as a kid, and my father wasn't getting regular health care. And so we didn't know. And he just, over that period from when I was 8 until when I was 12, when he passed away, he just deteriorated. And I didn't know what he'd be like from one night to the next. Some nights he'd be angry, some nights sad, even violent. And the thing that saved me was school, especially during that period when it was just my dad and me. As he got more and more sick and I was figuring out how to get food in our house, how to keep our household going, school was the one place in my life that was safe and stable and consistent. Had amazing public school teachers who made school a place where I could be a kid when I wasn't able to be a kid at home. And it was because of those teachers that I survived, and it's because of them that I became an educator and committed to a life in public service. You know, it's also worth saying that after my dad passed, I moved around different family members, different schools. I actually struggled a lot as a teenager, as often happens for young people who've experienced trauma. Got in so much trouble in high school that I got kicked out of high school. I'm the first United States Secretary of Education in history to have been kicked out of high school.
It's a great story.
Yeah. And, you know, my life could have gone in a lot of directions at that point. You know, it would have been easy for folks to look at me and say, here's a Black Puerto Rican kid, family in crisis, struggling in school, no respect for authority, and just giving up on me. But I was very lucky that there were teachers and a school counselor and some family members who were willing to give me a second chance. And that was critical to my being able to get my life on track and going on to be a teacher and principal and so forth. And to tie back to your initial question of how this leads to running for governor, you know, as an educator, you see how all the other systems impact kids and families, from housing to food insecurity to whether or not they have health care, whether or not parents can find a good job. And ultimately, I think governors are uniquely positioned, particularly our next governor of Maryland, to make government a force for good in people's lives across those issues, in much the same way that schools were such a powerful force for good in my life.
Okay.
You want me to describe some of the campaign priorities, or you want to keep doing Q&A style?
No, I mean, I enjoy both, but I want to know what motivated somebody who served at the national level in the Department of Education not to want to broaden their policy impact. And I mean, clearly, look, you reached the pinnacle of success to run the U.S. Department of Education and to be responsible for the first African Americans. Department of Education has to be like a crowning achievement that one wears when it feels a great pride. And I know of many of your accomplishments that when you were there. But like, what made you decide to sit back and say, you know, I'm not going to continue devoting my life to education, but I'm going to broaden my scope. I have something to offer beyond education. Now, obviously, most surveys show that education is the number one thing on people's minds, which gives you, but what else? I mean, I see a lot of things on your website: climate change, the Black agenda, education, economic. Why don't you expand a little bit on why you're running for governor?
Sure. Yeah. Look, you know, when you work with students, you really learn as a teacher to try to see the whole child and the whole family. And that's really what draws me to the role that a governor can play. Of course, there's a lot of work we need to do on education. We need to follow through in the blueprint for Maryland's future and make sure that we invest in all of our schools equitably. We need to expand pre-K. We need to strengthen career and technical education. We need to raise teacher pay. There's a lot of urgent work in education and work to build on the blueprint, like universal childcare, birth through 5, which is a priority for me. Investing in our community colleges and our historically Black colleges and universities that are such an engine of social mobility. So lots of work to do in education. But alongside that, if we want kids and families to be successful, there's a lot of work we need to do on what I would describe as economic dignity issues. I'm really glad the General Assembly passed paid family leave this session, but it'll be up to the next governor to implement it. ensuring that we have the supply of housing that folks can afford is a critical role for the state. There's much more that the state could be doing from both a zoning perspective and investment in our housing trust fund perspective to help drive the supply of affordable housing. There's more the state could be doing to ensure everyone has health care. Health care should be a human right, but we've got more than 350,000 Marylanders who don't have health care. That is something a governor can solve. We need to invest much more in public transportation. You know, our current governor, Governor Hogan, he's never met a highway expansion project he didn't love. And if you could work in toll lanes and make it profitable for a toll company, he loves it even more. But the truth is, we should be investing in public transit. We should build the Red Line in Baltimore. We should finish the Purple Line. We should build the Southern Maryland Light Rail project. We should increase the frequency of MARC trains. We should make bus service more frequent and reliable. We should make it easier for folks to bike and walk places. Those transportation issues are economic dignity issues because they're day-to-day quality of life issues. If you can't get to the doctor, if you can't get to visit your grandchild, that undermines your quality of life. So economic dignity is a huge focus for me. And then, as you mentioned, climate is to me an urgent existential crisis. I co-chair a national commission on mobilizing the K-12 sector to tackle climate action. And I co-chair that with Christy Todd Whitman, who was governor of New Jersey and EPA administrator for George Bush. And it's a bipartisan commission. We've got civil rights organizations, environmental activists, young people, educators from every level, from the classroom to state leaders to the presidents of both national teachers unions. And in that work, there's one story I'll share with you that really sticks with me around climate. We did a series of listening sessions with folks around the country who are working on climate issues. And we had a woman come and talk with us who's on the school board in Santa Barbara. And she described running for school board in Santa Barbara and running on a climate action platform. And people didn't really take her seriously. She won her seat. And then she was the one person on the board who at every board meeting would raise, why aren't we getting electric school buses? Hey, we're building that new building. Why aren't we putting solar panels on it? And people wouldn't pay very much attention to her. And then there was a drought, and then there were wildfires, and then there were mudslides, and there was loss of life and destruction of property, the blocking of a major highway for a significant period of time. And suddenly people got it around the urgency of climate action and making schools hubs of resilience. And so now Santa Barbara has a very ambitious district-wide climate action and resilience plan. But what was so haunting about that conversation is that could be us. If we don't act, then we will end up seeing more and more of these natural disasters. And ultimately, I am certain we will respond, but I don't want to wait until we see tremendous harm. We already have flooding in Ellicott City. We are losing farmland on the eastern shore to saltwater intrusion. So we need ambitious climate action now. And, I hope folks will check out our website, johnkingforgovernor.com. But we've been by far the most clear and specific on what we need to do in terms of building standards and transportation policy and growing renewable energy to get Maryland to be one of the first states to be net zero greenhouse gas emissions, and also to tackle some of our environmental justice issues.
I can tell you, John, that a poll just came out that asked members of the Jewish community what their top policy priorities are, and what do you think is the top policy priority nationally for Jews under the age of 40? And you named it.
Then I would certainly think climate.
Climate change was 30% of Jews under the age of 40 named climate change as their most important domestic issue. Yeah. So you're right on target there when you're talking about the challenges that our younger generation are feeling towards about the world we live in.
Absolutely. And there's a level of climate anxiety. I think about being at a event in Easton, Talbot County. and a young woman just breaking into tears, and she's probably in her early 20s, thinking about how her home will be underwater if we don't take aggressive action on climate. And I think one of the things we've got to do for young people, and I've got two daughters, 15 and 18, we've got to give them a sense that there's actually some things we can do, that they can do, and that we can do collectively, so that folks aren't just sitting in this fear about the consequences of climate change.
Going.
Sure. Well, I guess the last point I'd make on sort of the broader policy vision is, and you framed my family history, I think as we tackle education and economic dignity and the environment, we've got to bring a racial justice lens to that work. I believe that as a matter of lived experience, I believe that as a matter of principle. And as you pointed out, I have a deep appreciation for our state's history around issues of race. And the reality is, when I'm standing inside of that cabin, on the property where my great-grandfather was enslaved, and contemplating our family history, I think about the legacy of the institution of slavery, the legacy of segregation and redlining in our state. We have the highest rate of incarceration of young Black men in the country, in Maryland, higher than Alabama, higher than Mississippi. That's tied to that history. We have huge health disparities, huge gaps in family wealth, tied to that history. But the other thing I think about when I'm standing inside of that cabin is how profound it is that my family went in 3 generations from enslaved in that cabin to serving in the cabinet of the first Black president. And that's a powerful statement about the possibility of progress. And ultimately, on these racial justice issues, I believe we can make tremendous progress in Maryland. We have to start by naming and acknowledging them, and then working diligently in every sector to apply a racial justice lens. One of the things I've called for is that every bill before the General Assembly, now it's required to have a fiscal impact statement. I think there should be a racial equity impact statement and a climate impact statement, because every decision we make, whether it's about transportation policy or housing or economic development, is going to have implications for whether or not we are advancing racial equity and climate action.
So let me start by asking you a question. You've just won your 2nd term as governor. You can't believe it. You pulled this dramatic upset. You've won your 2nd term as governor. You're like Governor Hogan now. You're looking back in your final and 8th year, and you want to look back because just like we all look back and we want to think we did something right for our kids. Oh, let me just please note the presence of Judge Chernovsky from the Associate Judge from Montgomery County Circuit Court. Judge, thank you for joining us. You're looking back. You want to say 3 things I got done as governor. 3 things, forget about, I cut a blue ribbon, I issued a proclamation, I balanced the budget. 3 things you want to look back and you want to tell your grandchildren when you say, when I was governor 30 years ago, these were 3 things that I got done that I'm proud of, and I want you to remember that.
I love this hypothetical. Strongest education system in the country. Right. We ought to have in Maryland not just the best education system for a state, but we should be competitive with the best countries in the world. Second would be being one of the first states to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions, and hopefully creating a model for the country of how you get to a renewable energy future in a way that spurs tremendous economic development. And then third, and maybe this is the hardest to measure, but I think creating a culture in which people feel a stake in each other's future across lines of race, religion, region of the state. And that's hard, but I think, President Obama would talk about the importance of leadership that appeals to our better angels. I feel like we've had, as a country, leadership over the last few years, certainly in the Trump years, that was appealing to the devil on our shoulder, and appealing to anger and resentment and hatred. And we need leadership that appeals to what's best in humanity. And I hope that's the tone I'll be able to set as governor.
I really appreciate, and I'm going to give everybody now, I'm going to go for another minute or so, and I'm going to ask everybody to please start putting questions in the chat box, or indicate by doing a hand or something single, or writing your name that you'd like, because this is not meant to be just a discussion between John and I, but a discussion between you, John, and all of us. So John, I was really intrigued with your third sort of priority, sort of setting a tone. And you served the national government, and now you're serving, and you had a chance to watch the President Obama's successor's term, and you had a chance to see where we are now. And I know you're and obviously education is your passion. Do you see, do you think we are just beyond the point where polarization has taken over our society, that we've become more of a society of dueling ideological sides that are more interested in scoring points than enhancing policy? Or do you think that education and public service truly has a way of bringing where most Americans, I think, want to be? They say it's the mushy middle, but I've never known compromise to be a better word. And I don't think anybody who's ever had a successful marriage or is in a successful marriage knows that compromise and being able to get along is part of that success. I'd like to know, how do you think you can help bring about that number three? Because personally, I think the deterioration of American democracy and the norms of civility are perhaps the greatest threat to our nation, more than any one singular policy issue. Yeah. And by the way, folks, please start entering your questions in the chat, or you're going to hear my questions all day. You're going to be really bored. Okay, go ahead.
A couple things. I think one is we need to talk to folks everywhere across the state and help people see where there are tremendous shared interests. I think about being in Western Maryland and the degree to which the opioid addiction crisis is a huge challenge, and folks feel like there's not, and they're right. There's not enough addiction treatment. There's not enough recovery beds. Almost everyone you talk to has been affected by the opioid crisis, has lost someone to opioid addiction. And then you go to Baltimore, and there's a tremendous addiction crisis, and not enough addiction treatment providers, and not enough recovery beds. And maybe at the outset, folks' politics are different and the demographics are different, but at the end of the day, the issue of addiction and the need for a mental health and treatment infrastructure to respond to addiction is shared across geographies. And I think a governor can help people see that shared challenge. Paid family leave. Although there were not Republican votes for paid family leave turns out to be a everybody everywhere issue, because Republicans have babies too, and Republicans have family members, sadly, who get sick too. And so when you really start to sit down with folks and say, do you think that a woman should have to go back to work 10 days after giving birth? Or if someone in your family was sick, would you want to be able to take time, if they were terminally ill, to spend time with them and take care of them? And when you get to that level, that human set of questions, the values are really shared across our state and our society. That's why you get 80% plus approval for paid family leave. So we've got to, I think, frame issues in ways that speak to people's common humanity, and try to build from that sense of common humanity. But it's hard. I mean, and cable news every day is feeding the beast of antagonism. But I think a governor can help shift that.
I think it's going to be really important for whoever wins governor, and frankly, whoever wins elected office in this next round, to serve to I've always said, when we start again, I've always said America doesn't have a national religion. In England, it's the Anglican Church. In other countries, there's a national religion. But because we don't have a national religion, our elected officials, for better or for worse, take on the role of some sort of moral authority in office, which Americans cling to. And I think it's incumbent upon, in an age of bigotry and anti-Semitism and racism and all the other isms ripping at our society, that we have an outspoken governor. There's nothing more reassuring. Whenever I've worked with governors in Maryland, Virginia, and with mayors in DC for the last 25 years on behalf of the Jewish community. And I'll tell you that one of the greatest indicators of where their heart is whether I have to call them to ask them to denounce anti-Semitism, or whether they themselves go ahead and do it first. We have some good questions. The first person asked about loan forgiveness, but that's a federal issue. Not a state issue. Rich asks, Secretary King, thank you for joining us this morning. With you as governor, how can we increase equity within our public schools for all of our children, but especially those with disabilities? Thank you.
Sure. Well, let me say one thing quickly on the debt cancellation. Agree with you. It is a federal issue, and I was the first Secretary of Education ever to call for the president to cancel debt for all borrowers. But there is some more that the state could do. And we have a small tax credit that's available to folks who have significant student debt. I've proposed quadrupling that. The state can be doing more to keep community colleges and our four-year public institutions affordable so that folks can truly graduate debt-free. So I want to forgive the state totally from responsibility on that issue. On the broader education equity question, look, I think we've got to start with some of the resource gaps that we have. Every December, you have a news story out of Baltimore of kids and teachers sitting in a classroom with hats and gloves on because the heat isn't working. That's unacceptable, right? So we should start with, we have to provide in every school what each of us would want for our own kids. Every school should have a safe building, healthy conditions for learning. Every school should have adequate school counselors and mental health services. That is not true today. I just talked not long ago with a counselor in Prince George's County. She's a counselor assigned to 800 students and families. One counselor. How could she possibly address the needs of her students? So
you can't.
It's impossible. Exactly.
And it's not a fair burden.
Exactly. And then that impacts teachers, right? Because they feel like if they have a kid who's struggling, they have no one to refer that kid and family to. And so then that burns them out. So resource equity, right? That has to be at the foundation, but that's not enough. You've really got to have a real commitment to continuous self-examination around equity issues. Montgomery County, where I live, we have a lot of resources. We have a lot of good schools. And we still have some real equity gaps. And we have schools where when you walk in the AP classes, the AP classes don't look like the school. The AP classes are overwhelmingly white or Asian American, and there are very few Black and Latino students. That's an equity issue. Or you walk into a school and you go after school to the robotics club, and there are no girls in the robotics club. Well, that's an equity issue.
You'll see my daughter.
Good. That's good. That's good. But that you have to have systems in place that require you to ask. And this is a lot of the work I do in the Education Civil Rights Organization. I lead the Ed Trust. You have to have systems in place that constantly ask you to assess whether you are providing equitable opportunity for students. And the blueprint gives us a lot of new tools to launch high quality career and technical education programs in high schools that don't have them, to launch early college programs in high schools that don't have them, to expand pre-K, particularly for low-income students. So there's a lot of good stuff in there, but we need a governor who will fully implement the blueprint. Governor Hogan tried to take $140 million out of the blueprint just this year in his initial budget and got tremendous pushback. So he allowed the money to go forward. But, the reality is these school finance reform packages that often pass with fanfare, but then the money never comes because there isn't the follow through. And as governor, I'll make sure that we follow through, and I'll be focused every day on making sure that all of our kids get a world-class education.
John, we have a question from Judge Chernosky. Judge, I hope I'm going to ask your question, but there's a lot of meat packed into that question. So if I fail to do so, I'm going to unmute you and ask you to simplify it for me. Can I just do that now and ask you to unmute you right now? Okay, please unmute yourself and ask that question, because I have a master's degree from Georgetown. I didn't go to the law center, so I need your help with that.
Sorry, I tried to make it understandable.
No, it is to most people, but there's so much good in there, and so many good questions. I thought that if I read it, people would understand it better if you expressed it.
Thank you so much. So I have just been appointed in December by Governor Hogan. I was a lifetime public defender, and so although I am Caucasian and not diverse in terms of my race or my ethnicity, I am diverse in terms of the background that I bring to the bench. What do you think your position would be, and how would you try to diversify the bench in all sorts of ways in making your appointments? And then step two is, I think what we're seeing is the risk in that we are now needing to be voted in November. So we're on the ballot and we are having to take a political role, which is completely against my nature. I'm not a political person at all, but it also doesn't really bode well in my mind for the confidence that we're building in the community when I'm reaching out to lawyers to raise money and to help support me. And yet they're the lawyers coming in front of me and practicing in front of me. And what does that look like? And what dynamic does that present? So also, do you support judges having to be elected, and what would your position be? And how can you help to diversify the applicants putting in for the position? Because the risk of losing your legal career if you give it up and get appointed and then don't win in the election is really limiting the diversity of the people who are willing to take that risk and to put in. So hopefully that clarifies the question or questions. Yeah.
Well, it's such an important issue. So I have to say I am skeptical about judicial elections. I prefer a vision of a independent judiciary that isn't worrying about elections, raising money for campaigns, and is able, after a very substantive vetting process, able to make their best judgments without those political considerations. I don't know that we could change that in Maryland. Now, there are a lot of folks who are attached to judicial elections, but from my perspective, I prefer not to have the elections. On the first part of your question on diversity on the bench, I'm glad to celebrate your appointment as a public defender. I was thrilled that President Biden chose Ketanji Brown Jackson, who has a background as a public defender. I think that's important. If you look across the judiciary around the country, prosecutors are very overrepresented and folks with experience as public defenders underrepresented. We have to be intentional about racial diversity, about diversity, gender diversity, including LGBTQ folks, life experience. I think the perspective, and you see this in some of Justice Sotomayor's opinions, her experiences growing up as a Puerto Rican woman is a different perspective than some of her colleagues bring. And so we have to be intentional about diversity across a wide range of indicators on the bench. I certainly am committed to that. When I was Secretary of Education, majority of our political appointees were people of color. which is a majority of our public school kids. A majority of our public school kids today are people of color. So I think intentionality about recruiting a diverse pool is critical. If we didn't have the looming fear of the election, that probably would help with recruiting a more diverse pool. I agree with you. But even with the reality of the current law around judicial elections, we need a governor who will be dogged about recruiting and appointing diverse folks to the bench, and I will be.
Now, I got to tell you, the judges mentioned that lawyers who may be coming before her can donate to her campaign. To me, is a big odor, and I don't like it. Now, and I understand that elected officials have to raise money, and whether you believe in public finance or whether you don't, there are, so I wonder if it's kind of interesting. This is not a question to answer, but I'm kind of pondering out loud now whether we have more safeguards when people are running for legislative office than we do for judicial appointments. And that's something in serious need of reform if that's the case. I mean, you can't have, you don't want lawyers, that just bothers me as somebody who has been in this field for 25 years and has never been tainted by an ethical anything, who's a lobbyist and head of a 501c3. It truly bothers me. Isaac Snyder, how are you there, buddy? Has a great question. Secretary King, can you go into small detail of a policy on any topic you've implemented in the past, maybe at the Department of Education or one of your other roles that you think you can scale up as governor? Is there some idea, something you look back and say, yeah, I'm really proud of what I did. This would be great for the state of Maryland, and I have the experience doing it.
Yeah. I'll give you one example. So when I was secretary, one of the things I worked on is an initiative called Second Chance Pell. And the context for this initiative is that in the mid-90s, in the crime bill, there were a lot of bad policies in the 94 crime bill. One of them was banning access to the Pell Grant program, which is the primary federal assistance for higher education for folks who are incarcerated. This is just terrible public policy. 95% of the people who are incarcerated are coming home. So it's in everybody's interest for folks to have more education and job training experience while they're incarcerated. But it was the mid-90s. The rhetoric was tough on crime. I talked to one woman who was incarcerated at the time who described the guards coming and taking the books out of the library, and after this ban was passed, and saying you won't need these anymore. Right? Just a cruel framing of a policy. So we wanted in the Obama administration to repeal that ban, but we had a Republican Congress that wasn't willing to do that. So we figured out how we could use our flexibility under the Higher Education Act to create a pilot project allowing 65 colleges and universities, including Goucher here in Maryland, to offer college courses to folks who are incarcerated using Pell Grants. Amazing programs, and I've visited a number of them. For many people, it is truly life-changing, and also changes their relationship with their family, because many folks who are incarcerated have kids. For their kids to see them while incarcerated pursuing higher education is a powerful message. So the program launched. It's actually one of the rare things where the Trump administration not only allowed an Obama initiative to continue, but actually expanded it. And in my role leading the Education Trust, I worked with other civil rights organizations, criminal justice reform organizations, to get members of Congress and governors to visit these programs and to build momentum to change the law. In December of 20, the law was changed, and that ban on Pell Grant access for incarcerated students was repealed. And the Education Department is now in the process of implementing guidance for states and prison systems and higher ed institutions. So we have an opportunity in Maryland, as we think about how we advance public safety, to radically rethink incarceration and to say, while incarcerated, folks need access to addiction treatment, mental health services, educational programming, job training, so that when folks come home, they are better prepared to be successful. And we need reentry supports. We need to help folks who are returning home. And the judge understands this very much, right? I mean, this is core to how we advance public safety, helping the folks who are reentering, those returning citizens, find housing, find employment, mediation programs that while they're incarcerated and as they're returning home, help them resolve conflicts with family members. These things are hugely important to making their return home successful and preventing them from going back to the things that got them incarcerated in the first place. So this is an educational initiative, but it's really a public safety initiative and reimagining public safety in a way that is much healthier than I think the approach we've taken as a country over the last few decades.
John, you served as education commissioner in New York, correct? For about
I did.
4 years or
Yeah.
so. Under which mayor?
So it was, I started, largely it was under Governor Cuomo, although we were—
state education.
State education, yeah. Although we were, in New York, the structure is that the State Board of Regents, the State Board of Education, is appointed by the legislature, not the governor. Mm-hmm. So the relationship with the governor is complicated, as you might imagine. And probably any relationship with Andrew Cuomo is complicated.
Any relation with Cuomo?
With Andrew Cuomo is complicated.
Yeah, I think we'll just stop right there and let that stay safe. Let it stand alone as his own sentence. Question. So when you were I'm from Brooklyn, New York. Okay. And
mm-hmm.
I went to public schools there. I'm educated there. I spent half my life in Maryland, and I spent half my life in New York. And no matter what anybody says here, New York will never have as good pizza, bagels, knishes, and pastrami sandwiches. And Baltimore has not succeeded at that, despite their best attempt. I'm confirming that for the official record in my power as JCRC director. But I'd like to add, but Maryland, like New York, has both urban, suburban, and rural districts. Mm-hmm. And trying to get to improve education across the state, when you have these different types of populations, I mean, how do you as governor aim resources in a way? So for example, it may take less money to fix schools on the Eastern Shore than it does in Baltimore. And the votes are in Baltimore. So how do you make sure that you are, how are you going to make sure as governor, when you make education, which was your number one thing you said you wanted to be look back at after your 8th year as governor, how do you prioritize that funding? How do you make sure that you're addressing the needs? I mean, money is in limited supplies. You can't, and even though we have an enormous budget, how do you make sure that, the people in, St. Mary's or people on the Eastern Shore who have a couple of public schools that may not be doing so well, but then on the other hand, you've got to fix air conditioning units in 300 schools. How do you balance that? How do you prioritize that when equity in school and performance are all interconnected? So the question, I'm trying to give people an example of the question. Yeah. How do you prioritize educational resources when in a limited budget, when so much needs to be done?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, a couple things. One is, as you're building your funding formula, and this is really what we tried to do in the blueprint, and I was involved with a number of civil rights organizations that worked to advance the blueprint. You try to build a funding formula that increases the weight for students in poverty, for English learners, for students with disabilities, so that you're targeting resources to the schools that have the greatest challenges. At the same time, I think it's important to have state initiatives that are addressing some of the unique challenges of both rural and urban schools. So I'll give you a couple examples. Finding secondary STEM teachers, so science, mathematics, computer science. That is a huge challenge in St. Mary's County, a huge challenge in a Dorchester County, and a huge challenge in Baltimore. And so one of the things that we've proposed is a debt forgiveness program targeted at folks who are willing to commit to teach in some of our highest need communities, whether those are rural or urban, because we have to have those rigorous college-ready courses available to kids everywhere in the state. Another example of a shared problem, advanced placement classes. Oftentimes, it's high-need schools, urban, in some cases suburban and rural, that aren't offering the range of AP classes. Whereas you go to, let's say, a Whitman in Montgomery County, and you see, a huge catalog of AP classes. And those matter. Those matter for college admissions. Those matter actually for the cost of college. If you have AP courses, many colleges count those as college credits. So there's a lot of good that can come of having those AP courses. We ought to be doing more to make sure that rural schools and urban schools can get those classes. Sometimes they don't have enough students. And one of the solutions that is possible, and it's one of the kind of few good things one can say about the virtual learning period, is we've learned that you don't have to have the course offered in the building for kids to be able to take the course. And so you can make available that AP computer science course to a kid at a high school in Baltimore where there aren't that many kids signed up for it, or a kid at a high school in St. Mary's County where there aren't that many kids in the high school. You can have that AP computer science class offered to all of them through a blended learning model. So there are some things that are shared that I think that we can tackle. But you're right. I mean, this is the challenge for our next governor. How do you make sure that you are a governor for the whole of the state, and that every community is getting the attention they should from the state government? But I'm deeply committed to that.
Thank you. I really appreciate your answer on that. That's a difficult question. I appreciate your answer. Rich is asking a second question. I'm going to pose it, and this is going to be the last question before summation, unless anybody else puts another question into the inbox, in which case I'm happy to ask it. Rich asks, building on your prison program. By the way, people should know, I had a long talk with Sydney Katz, our council member yesterday. People should know that in Montgomery County, in our Clarksburg, we do have job fairs in our prison in Montgomery County. Many folks in prison have undiagnosed learning disabilities like dyslexia. And I'll also add, many kids in our school system have undiagnosed disabilities. How do we make sure kids are diagnosed and receive the services they need in school? And I'm gonna go back to Rich's question, and don't end up, and that because some of these kids who have disabilities that are undiagnosed or don't get the help, they end up in the school to prison pipeline. So in general, how do we deal with the onslaught of disabilities? I mean, we have tons of kids, including my own, who have an IEP or a 504 and other sorts of things. How do we make sure, especially when we have one guidance counselor for every 800 kids, like you said, that we make sure that we equip our kids, that we get the kids the diagnostic help that they need, so that we can support them. So truly, no child is left behind. No.
That's right.
Right. And I'm saying that in a non-political democratic way.
Right. So many pieces there. I mean, so one is challenge in our prisons has been that many prisons offer very limited educational programming. I visited a number of prisons where the only educational offering is GED programs. Mm-hmm. Well, if you are a struggling reader, and we have many folks who are incarcerated, often because of dyslexia, but often as well because of poor educational experiences, who have low literacy skills. A GED program is not what you need. What you need is real literacy instruction so that you can build towards the GED. So making sure we invest in the full range of educational programming for folks who are incarcerated, critical. Including the diagnostics to figure out if someone has dyslexia so we can respond appropriately. Earlier in kids' lives, we should be doing much more to use what some people refer to as the science of reading. But in essence, we actually know a tremendous amount about how to teach reading effectively in the early grades in a way that ensures that dyslexic kids are getting what they need. And it's actually beneficial for all kids. It turns out that there are some kids who can learn to read without exposure to decoding skills, understanding what the letters represent and the sounds that they make and how to put those together. But it's only some kids who can learn without that. Dyslexic kids will never be able to learn without that explicit decoding instruction. And it turns out that for most kids, explicit decoding instruction is helpful. And even for kids who can learn without explicit decoding instruction, there's no harm to them from explicit decoding instruction. And some evidence that suggests it makes them stronger early readers. So we have to make sure that our teachers understand that science of reading. One of the things we've laid out in our education plan that I hope folks will check out at johnkingforgovernor.com is a real intense investment in reading training, reading specialists, making sure that in those early grades, we get kids to proficiency in reading. Because the reality is, if you're not a proficient reader by third grade, you're going to struggle. You know, that K-3 period, my wife was a kindergarten and first grade teacher. We talk a lot about this. K-3, you're learning to read. Right. After third grade, you're reading to learn. You're not going to be able to access science or social studies, even sometimes math, if you don't have those strong reading skills. So that'll be a big focus for us. The other thing I'd observe is we have a lot of kids who've fallen behind over the last 2 years. You know, I'm the only candidate across the 13 candidates on the Democratic and Republican sides who has a kid currently in public school. And it's been hard. You know, last year I had a senior and a freshman. They were virtual all year. My senior missed all of the rituals of senior year. My freshman, she was in classes all year with kids and teachers she'd never met in the physical world.
I had 3 kids in public school and during the pandemic, and to use their eloquent word, quote, "It sucked, Dad."
Yes. And we've got to, now as we recover, we got to make up for that. One of the things I've proposed is a statewide tutoring corps and mobilizing recent college graduates and retired teachers to be tutors working with students one-on-one, two-on-one, to help make up for some of the academic consequences of this period, but also just to build those mentoring relationships. We have kids who've gotten disconnected from school over this period and really need those supportive mentoring relationships. And that could also be a way to address some of the students who are struggling readers and need that additional support, as long as the tutors have the right training around the science of reading.
John, on that final note, please sum up most of the form. First of all, thank you for joining us. We've had most of the forums that we've had. Most of the candidates have summed up by saying why I'd like your vote, or why I'd like your financial support, or why I'd like you to volunteer, or why I'd like you to follow me. Please take the next minute or two in any way you wish to address the people who've woken up this morning to learn about your campaign.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for a great conversation. I would love for folks on the call to get involved in the campaign. Certainly contributing would be hugely helpful, volunteering, door knocking, phone banking. And I'd say getting involved in the campaign is not just about this one election, but really for me, what I hope people take away is that we're trying to build a movement to get to a more just and prosperous future for our state. This is about changing the policy conversation in ways that advance values of social justice. And what I bring to this race, I think uniquely, is both a very ambitious vision for social justice and experience in getting big things done in government. And we've got candidates in this race who've never been in government, never run anything particularly large. They're going to have a hard time turning what they say in the campaign into action. We've also got some folks in this race who've been in government a long time, but don't offer a lot of ambition around how government could be a force for good in people's lives. What we're trying to do in this campaign is articulate an ambitious vision for a stronger future for the state, and explain that I have the experience. You know, our budget at the education department is $15 billion bigger than the budget of the state of Maryland. the experience to actually turn that vision into action. So I really do hope folks will check us out, johnkingforgovernor.com, and get involved.
On that note, I want to thank you very much for your very comprehensive and interesting and informative and diverse subject array of topics that you spoke about. Thank you for giving us time this morning. Have a good week. Thank you all.